So I guess maybe that's the cue to start up the evening's events. I'm Eugene Goltz. I'm a professor here at the LBJ School and a distinguished scholar of the Robert Strauss Center. And one of the distinguished things I'm lucky enough to get to do is organize and introduce these talks, which is a real pleasure for me. The International Security Speaker Series, this being the first of our spring series, and I have three administrative tasks before I introduce our speakers really quickly that have to do with the series. And the first is to remind you this is in fact a series. We're very glad you came to this one, but there are at least three more this semester. The next one being on March 11th with Julian Zelizer, who also has a new book on the history of the Cold War. In fact, I was just noodling around on the web about our fine speakers for today, and I found that Fred here has hosted a
salon, they call it.
A salon. Wow, that is very the terms here. My gosh, a salon.
That's what they called it.
On Fire Dog Lake, which some of you may be familiar with this blog on the web, Fire Dog Lake. And so Fred did a salon on Julian's book, and it's all very inbred when you study the Cold War. And so Julian's book is on domestic politics and the Cold War, and funnily enough, these guys are going to talk about domestic politics and the Cold War today. So if you come to the pair of events, you'll get really interesting overlapping, contrasting, compared perspectives. So really encourage you on March 11th. So that was task one. Task two is Julian has a new book. These guys have a new book. In fact, their new book is there at that table. And there's a brilliant discount. I'm not sure what the discount is. I think it's 87% off. $20 flat out for the book, which is a great deal for an academic, fancy hardcover. I mean, this is unheard of, you know. So buy the book. They're going to tell you all the secrets, but when you read the book, you'll get them even more. So there you go. That's task two. Task three is we're all on candid camera right now. It's actually candid camera. The gag was it surprised us, but we're not surprised. This is going out to a cast of thousands on the web and will be there permanently. And because we want to know in the Q&A what you asked and the people on the internet want to know also, please remember to use the microphone. And I will try to remember to remind you as well. But when it comes to the Q&A, use the mic. Okay, so that's my administrative tasks. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Fred and Campbell to talk about their new book on the Cold War. Really interesting hypothesis that I'm not going to, waste their approach to telling it by telling you about it, but I think it's a very interesting book. We're in for a great treat. They're going to tag team the talk, which is actually, quite interesting. They're going to switch back and forth in different segments of the talk, so you'll get a whole perspective on different voice patterns and intonation and whatever that means. I'm looking forward to that too. But they're both highly esteemed, towering figures in our field now. I think it's great when we're at that stage. So Fred is the John Knight Professor of International Studies. Is that the title? Okay, at Cornell, where he runs the International Studies Center on campus. And many of you have read in classes here, those who were in classes, his fantastic book on the Vietnam War. And that was an important episode in the Cold War. Now it's all the Cold War. Campbell Craig is a professor of international relations at the University of Aberystwyth in Wales. He's been at many other wonderful institutions before, but some of you may know Aberystwyth is the first program in international affairs, international relations. It's 200 years old. It's the mothership. It's the top program in England. We were just discussing this university has nothing else. I probably shouldn't, say that on the web, but
You don't want to get Welshmen angry.
exactly. But it's really cool to be a professor of international relations at Aberystwyth, and so we're thrilled to have them here, and I'll let them tell you about the Cold War. So please.
Thank you.
Should this stay here?
Yeah. So
Okay.
you can turn it toward yourself, whatever you need. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Eugene. It's really nice to be here with all of you today. I also want to begin by thanking the LBJ School, and in particular Frank Gavin. I think the idea for this visit, if I'm not mistaken, might have been hatched when the three of us were in Oslo together this past June. And Frank said, well, you have to come to the LBJ School, to Austin, to give this talk, and here we are. So thank you, Frank. And to be in this new facility, or at least this renovated facility, is nice. I have spent many a day walking past this building to go to the LBJ Library for research, and it's good to be inside. As Eugene said, we are going to attempt something that I don't think either one of us has done before, which is a kind of tag team approach. We considered having one sentence each, taking turns, but that would be probably not a good thing to do. So we're going to have, we've decided, basically 5 sections. We might decide, or you might decide afterwards, that even that is a bit too orchestrated, if you will, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to just say a few words about what we're attempting to do in this book. Campbell is going to outline for you the main arguments that we make. Then I think we're going to try to zero in briefly on 2 particular elements, case studies, I guess you could call them, that we hope will illuminate these arguments that Campbell will articulate. And then seeing, depending on where we are with time, I suppose, I will wrap up with just a few observations on where this puts us today. One of our arguments is, in fact, that the thesis of the book, the argument that we make, apply very much to the post-Cold War world, and indeed to U.S. foreign policy in the year 2010 in much the way that it did during the Cold War. This is, of course, a Cold War book. The Cold War is, as you know, recent by historians' standards, but it has generated an enormous literature in the form of monographic studies, in the form of other scholarly works, memoirs by former officials, journalistic accounts, many of which, by the way, are very good. And I think especially in the last 12, 15 years, we have seen a bunch of path-breaking research. And that's one reason, by the way, that we decided that the time was right for this book. I should note, by the way, that I'm going to read the paper, because one of my concerns in doing this kind of a talk is that if I try to speak extemporaneously or from notes, I'll go on much too long, so I've decided to just stick to my text. But we've seen a lot of this path-breaking research in the last dozen or so years. We now have two international journals devoted specifically to the Cold War. And I should also underscore the important work that has been done by outfits such as the Cold War International History Project and the National Security Archive. Phenomenal amount of excellent work that they have done that help those of us who write about the Cold War to do so. So there's a lot going on, is my point. Our focus in this book, as the title implies, is the United States. At all points after 1945, the most powerful actor in the global system. Now, in concentrating on the U.S., we are consciously bucking the historiographical trends, which is toward what is usually referred to as international history, the international history approach, which, as the name implies, seeks to move beyond a singular focus on a particular nation, a single nation, or even the bilateral Soviet-American relationship, to see how other actors in the system helped to shape and in turn were shaped by the struggle. We find much, I think I speak for Campbell here, we find much to admire in this international history. We have, in fact, both done international history, and I'm right now working on an international history of the struggle for Vietnam, for Indochina after 1940. For this book, however, we decided early on that it was not the right approach. And there are lots of reasons for this, and we could come back to talk about this if anybody's interested in the Q&A. I do want to say just a couple things about this. One is that we feel quite strongly that international history, for all of its contributions to date, has real and potential limitations for students of foreign relations. It risks, for example, and some international historians are quite explicit about wanting to do this, it risks decentering the superpowers, and in particular the United States. And the danger here is that in so doing they give some actors in the system more agency than they in fact deserve. And we argue that to downplay the role of the United States, to suggest that the United States was merely one power among many, is to ignore America's supreme preponderance since the Second World War, and hence its responsibility for so much that happened during the Cold War, both for good and for ill. Now, in saying this, we're not trying to privilege the United States, but simply to recognize the extreme power imbalances obtaining in most places, most of the time during the Cold War. Couple of questions that drive us, really, is why did the United States follow the course that it did after 1945? How were the major policy decisions pertaining to the Cold War reached? These two questions, why and how questions, are America-centered questions. They demand immersion, we argue, in American sources and knowledge, and they demand knowledge of American institutions, political culture, and social structure. International history has little to offer here, even if foreign archives can sometimes yield fascinating insights into U.S. policymaking. And so, even though our book, or in our book, one sees, or you'll see if you read it, a lot of appearances by Stalin, by Churchill, by Mao, by Ho Chi Minh, by Khrushchev, by Gorbachev, it is nevertheless American attitudes, American decisions that loom largest for us. It is American assessments of the actions and the decisions of these foreign leaders that concern us the most. I should note, finally, before I turn things over to Campbell to talk about the main arguments that we're trying to make, that in temporal terms we go beyond the Cold War. We go beyond, say, 1945 and 1991. In particular, we attach great importance to the colossal importance of World War II, to all that came later. And it's not merely the fact that in the wake of World War II, only the Soviet Union and the United States among the great powers were left standing, or at least had seen their geopolitical importance or geopolitical strength increased as a result of the war. It is also, we argue, the sheer devastation caused by 6 years of total war. We're talking about, after all, a conflict in World War II, which may well have seen the most profound and concentrated upheaval of humanity since the Black Death of the 14th century. And the number of those killed in the fighting worldwide is impossible to count, but the figure of 50 million people comes pretty close. And there are two other figures that I think are noteworthy here. One is that it has been estimated that in Germany and the Soviet Union alone, 7.5 million homes were destroyed in the fighting, and the second figure being that some 30 million people in those two countries lost their lives, at least 25 million of them being from the USSR. So this, of course, has very important implications for everything that happens later. Of special interest to us in this regard is that the effects for the United States of World War II were very different, but no less consequential. The United States suffered far fewer war-related deaths than any of the other major belligerents, virtually no physical damage. Its citizens' living standards actually rose during the fighting. thanks to an armament program that fully brought the country out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the United States, and this is where our book, of course, begins in earnest in 1944 and 45, the United States emerges from the war in a singularly powerful position, with its fixed capital intact, its resources more plentiful than ever, and in lone possession of the atomic bomb. What's more, the Second World War delivered a death knell to isolationism, one that was no less real for taking a few years to fully manifest. Well before war's end, most American elites had coalesced around the proposition that their nation must henceforth maintain a leadership position in world affairs. The era of free security, and we may talk a little bit more about that notion as we proceed today. It's very important in our book. The era of free security was over. And so the book really begins with a pretty close look at first the interwar period and then the effect of World War II in particular on American decision making. And with that, I'll turn it over to Campbell.
Yes, you get a tag team. Go on and get some pro wrestler now. I'm going to talk a bit about the actual general argument we make and our characterization of American foreign policy during the Cold War. And the general argument we make stems from an essential question that really is the overriding question of our book, which is why the Cold War lasted so long. The United States, as I'm sure most of you know, if not all of you know, set up a general strategy of containment immediately after the Second World War, which had a very specific objective, which was to ensure that the United States had powerful allies in Western Europe and also in Japan. And if that were achieved, the argument went, the Soviet Union would have no chance of even beginning to contemplate that it could expand across the Eurasian continent. And people like George Kennan argued that once the Soviet leaders understood this fact, they would turn inwards and eventually implode. And we think that, and argue very explicitly in the book, this was a brilliant strategy and one that underlay the American victory in the Cold War. However, the question we ask remains because of the fact that containment was largely achieved by around 1950. And we are interested in the fact that the United States, despite its achievement of containment in 1950, not only continued to wage the Cold War for another 40 years or so, but in American politics and in Washington, you have almost no sense at all that containment has been achieved and that therefore it's time, as per the logic of containment, to pursue a kind of endgame, to pursue the completion of the Cold War. We are interested fundamentally in answering why this is so. This is the underlying question of our book. And we believe that the two mainstream interpretations in American historiography about the Cold War do not adequately answer it. There's a traditional, some would say orthodox argument in Cold War historiography that regards the Cold War as an American response to Soviet malevolence, and that the United States was in the business of trying to make sure that Soviet leaders, especially Stalin, did not dominate the world, and that American policy was essentially reactive. And as I've just mentioned, we don't fundamentally disagree with that in looking at the beginnings of the Cold War. But what this argument cannot do, or does not normally try to do, is show why, once containment was achieved, the United States made no attempt to pursue endgame. I think it was about 10 after. There was no attempt by the United States to pursue a diplomatic accord with the Soviet Union after 1953 and Stalin's death. In the early 1960s, you have no attempt to achieve a deal with Khrushchev after the harrowing Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennan said it was very clear that you establish containment and then you step back. You create the boundaries past which the Soviet Union cannot go, and what you don't do is provide them with reasons to believe that the United States is being offensive. The United States aims to threaten the Soviet Union. That's the last thing you want to do because the Soviet Union will feed on that. The logical containment strategy was to back off after achieving it and let the Soviet Union implode. little attempt to do this after 1950, and the traditional argument has a hard time explaining why this is so. There's also a revisionist explanation of American foreign policy during the Cold War, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, which is that the Cold War was really about not defending the United States from Soviet predation, but rather a bid for global hegemony based upon the desire of American elites to achieve a world dominated by American capitalism. But this argument also does not easily explain why the Cold War went on so long. Think again of the early 1950s. The United States was dominant around the world. It dominated the world economy far more than it would later. It was in a position in Korea in the early 1950s to use the Korean War as a means of going on and attacking China and pursuing this worldwide hegemony right then and there, as many people, including, of course, famously General MacArthur, had advocated. But the United States does not do it. Hard for the revisionist argument as well to explain why the Cold War goes on and on and on. So these are problems that are faced by traditional historical schools in Cold War history. And in thinking about this, both Fred and I realized how disjointed this kind of interpretation is, not to understand American Cold War policy in terms of domestic politics. Think about any analysis of the foreign policy of the Obama administration today. Think of any serious analysis of the foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration 5 years ago. These sorts of analyses made by serious scholars, of course, emphasize the role of domestic political considerations in how President Bush or President Obama would make foreign policy. It's impossible to read anything that does not look at the political considerations at play when a president or a White House is considering making a foreign policy decision, especially one of some consequence. You cannot see any writing about that topic where these kinds of factors are not introduced. Yet, if you go back and look at most of the standard Cold War literature, you will find that the domestic political factor, which is so obvious when we're considering making a foreign policy today, disappears. The aspect of political incentive when you look at the way that foreign policy leaders see their foreign policy decisions in terms of domestic political advantage, so obvious to all of us in looking at contemporary politics, disappears from Cold War textbooks. We saw this as an opening, as a way to try to explain the question I've just outlined by using a factor that is largely omitted from most Cold War historiography. So what is it actually that we say? In explaining America's Cold War, we argue that the United States did have a genuine reason to fear Soviet domination of the Eurasian continent. There was a real security threat facing the United States after World War II. It was certainly not nearly as imminent as many people said. The Soviet Union was devastated. It was not a country that could threaten the United States immediately. But American leaders after World War II were right in believing that if the United States simply returned to an isolationist policy, the Soviet Union could obtain the kind of geopolitical momentum that would allow it to dominate the Eurasian continent. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but it was a good idea to be on the safe side and ensure that didn't happen. So we don't have any problem with the general argument of containment. We want to know why, after the containment approach was successful, as I've mentioned, the Cold War continued to go on. And our fundamental answer to that question is this. The Cold War continued to go on in terms of American history, right? Not international history, but looking at the American historical experience. Because the people who matter in Washington, politicians, lobbyists, interest groups, came to discover, especially after 1950, that they had a tremendous interest in seeing the Cold War continue. That there were very few important people in Washington who would benefit from a cessation of the Cold War, or a winding down of the Cold War. There was a gradual realization, this is not something that happens overnight, a gradual realization that the way Washington works, political contributions, campaigns every 2 years, satisfying the demands of interest groups, satisfying the demands of constituents at home, looking to make your voters happy when election time comes up. These kind of things encouraged political leaders and the other people who matter in Washington to recognize that perpetuation of the Cold War, all things being equal, would be of great benefit to them, and that ending the Cold War would do almost no one any political good. The Cold War, therefore, comes to an end in the late 1980s only after the Soviet Union offers a surrender so comprehensive that it becomes almost impossible for these political factors in Washington to deny it, even though, as we show, they certainly give it a good try. Reagan and the first President Bush, we give a fair amount of credit to for defying these alarmists in the late 1980s and accepting the Soviet surrender. Why the U.S.? Why is the United States why does the United States seem to be particularly struck by this political condition that we've described? Can't this be said of any nation? Don't domestic politics exist everywhere? I'll conclude this section by explaining why we think that the answer to that question is no. We believe that the United States foreign policy experience has been decisively shaped by its geographical position. The great oceans, along with the fact that the Europeans are busy beating one another up throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, provided America with what we call free security. The United States didn't have to worry for most of its existence about being conquered by another nation in the way that European states had to all the time. This made for, we believe, this tells us two things about America's Cold War. First is that you had a political tradition develop in Washington long before the Cold War began that was accustomed to politicizing foreign policy. American politicians were used to playing politics with foreign policy for the simple reason that you could get away with it in the United States because the stakes of getting something wrong were so low. So you had a tradition that existed in Washington as the Cold War unfolds, whereby there's foreign policy is fair game for politicking. And even more to the point, during much of the Cold War, this free security, in a basic sense, continued to exist. Once containment had been achieved around 1950, and once mutual assured destruction had been achieved around 1960, the prospects of America being conquered by another nation hadn't disappeared, but had returned to a very low level. Therefore, encouraging political leaders, we argue, to do what their predecessors had done before World War II and play politics with free security. And now Fred and I are going to talk about two particular illustrations of that.
I should note, by the way, especially since we're on tape, that we don't claim to coin the phrase free security. The great Yale historian C. Van Woodward, I believe, was the first to use the phrase, but it's something that we develop in much the way that Campbell has just described. I'm going to be brief in this section, but I do want to talk just a little bit about the late 1940s, which is important in any history of the Cold War, and certainly is the case in our book. We show in the book that already in 1946, this is long before Joseph McCarthy, for example, is on the scene, long before Korea and before the Soviet bomb. In 1946, in advance of the midterm elections that autumn, administration officials in the Truman administration are already then deeply sensitive to charges of quote-unquote appeasement. Appeasement has now become a pejorative in American political discourse, where it still remains, which still remains the case today. Charges of appeasement, should they even hint at a willingness to explore a compromise agreement with communist leaders. You see it already in 46. And of course, the Republicans score, as you know, significant gains in that election. And one of the determinations by the Truman team is that if they're going to have any chance of winning in 1948, this will have to change. And they will need to show that Harry Truman bows to no one in his opposition to Soviet expansionism, particularly in Eastern Europe. And so in advance of that election, 1948, the presidential election, Truman missed few opportunities to talk up the Cold War, a strategy urged on him by numerous advisors. And there's a particular document penned by White House aide Clark Clifford and former FDR assistant James Rowe, a document that one, I suppose, might refer to as a kind of domestic version, or as we might put it, the intermestic version of Kennan's earlier long telegram. This is a document that Clifford and Rowe produced not long after Kennan published his X article earlier in 1947, so this is now in the fall of 1947, in which these two aides argue, or predict, maybe I should say, that relations with the Soviet Union would be the key foreign policy issue in the coming campaign, that these relations would get worse during the course of 1948, and that this fact, this worsening of the bilateral relationship, would strengthen Truman's domestic political position. And I quote, "There is considerable political advantage in the administration in its battle with the Kremlin. The worse matters get, the more is there a sense of crisis. And in times of crisis, the American citizen tends to back up his president," unquote. And in fact, what you see in the months following that memo, which is a secret memo, is that White House speechwriters talked tough on Soviet-American relations and mocked Henry Wallace's call, also presidential candidate, former vice president, mocked Henry Wallace's call for improved relations with the Kremlin, portraying him as an unwitting dupe of communists at home and abroad. Truman said at a St. Patrick's Day speech in March, "I do not want and I will not accept the political support of Henry Wallace and the communists," unquote. This was, we argue, a conscious blurring of domestic and foreign communism, and it would have a profoundly important impact, profoundly important implications for politics in Cold War America. And this, of course, is well before a certain Senator Joe McCarthy had become a household name. And what we see, and certainly what we argue in the book, is that you see then the beginning of an anti-communist crusade inside the United States that paralleled the Cold War abroad, a crusade that contained a large element of practical politics, and I would note, had no real likeness anywhere else in the Western world in either scope or intensity. Opposing radicals and opposing the Soviet Union was a way of attracting votes, of building a political reputation, or at least of avoiding being denounced as a fellow traveler. Meanwhile, any possibility for honest debate and criticism about policy toward the communist world disappeared, as those on the left and the center-left who might have articulated an alternative vision lost cultural and political approval. And one of the things we say in the book is that the kind of campaign that Henry Wallace could run in 1948, which was a serious national campaign, he didn't do particularly well, but it was a legitimate national campaign that got a lot of press coverage. That kind of left-of-center campaign becomes impossible to imagine for at least 2 decades thereafter. Campbell now will talk about another example.
Yes, well, the Clifford Rowe memorandum, we argue, represents one aspect of the politics of insecurity, and this has to do with the internal desires of the Truman administration to recognize how the Cold War can be used for domestic political advantage. A second example that I want to talk about very briefly is different in the sense that it was public rather than being secret. And it was not undertaken by people in power, but by a politician who wanted to be in power. And that, of course, was John F. Kennedy in the late 1950s and in 1960. And this, I will be talking about his famous or infamous missile gap charge, which we think is another fine example of the politics of insecurity that we're talking about. In the late 1950s, as many of you know, both the United States and the Soviet Union developed thermonuclear missiles, which were reaching the capability of being able to destroy one another completely. And American leaders, especially Eisenhower, recognized correctly that if the Soviet Union could possibly threaten the United States, if there was any way that the Soviet Union could still defeat the U.S., it would be for the Soviet Union to gain such an advantage in its nuclear capabilities that it could launch a first strike against the United States and defeat the U.S. that way. Eisenhower had recognized this early on, back in 1955, and what he did is build a gigantic nuclear arsenal and warning system that would guarantee beyond any possible doubt that the Soviet Union, if it tried something like this, would be devastated in a retaliation that would put an end to the existence of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower recognized in 1955 that this was the overriding objective of his defense policy, and indeed it was one of the last things that really needed to be done to guarantee that the United States could be safe, even in a nuclear world. So Eisenhower had done what anyone might have said he should have done, which was to build a nuclear deterrent in the late 1950s to make sure that the Soviet Union could not threaten the United States. And we know now that by 1960, the American arsenal dwarfed the Soviet one in every conceivable way. It was just a much, much more powerful and technologically advanced nuclear arsenal than the Soviet one. And indeed, Eisenhower administration knew that fairly well itself as a result of its secret U-2 flights and other intelligence that told the Eisenhower administration that the United States was probably well ahead of the Soviet Union in nuclear missiles. He couldn't say this publicly because that would be admitting that the U-2 flights existed, but the Eisenhower administration knew that. Why should this be a problem? Eisenhower did what he's supposed to do, which is protect the United States. The problem with this, the problem with achieving nuclear deterrence, with achieving the condition of mutual assured destruction, was that this would put a brake on the politics of insecurity. It would put a brake on the idea that the United States continued to be threatened by the Soviet Union. If you achieve mutual assured destruction, you achieve a safety that people have a hard time arguing with. And this, of course, would limit the possibilities of political actors in Washington to continue to hype the Soviet threat as a way of obtaining the political advantages that I talked about earlier. In a way, you sort of have a mirror of containment. Containment is achieved by 1950. Policy done, well done. The United States did it brilliantly in the 1940s. Mutual assured destruction is a similar sort of thing. It's achieved by the Eisenhower administration in the late 1950s. This poses a threat to the political forces we're talking about. And so you see in the late 1950s an avalanche of criticism of Eisenhower administration policy and a massive political movement to discredit the idea of nuclear deterrence and mutual assured destruction. Strategists at think tanks and big universities, arms industrialists, labor unions working for these arms industries, and especially the Democratic Party, supposedly the party of the left. It was not so in the late 1950s, whose leaders began to argue that the Eisenhower administration was dangerously neglecting American defenses. This was the argument made by famous senators like Henry Jackson of Washington State, Stuart Symington of Missouri, and of course eventually by the young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Kennedy faced a very vivid, we argue, choice once he received the Democratic nomination in the spring of 1960, and one that I think we think really characterizes this idea of the politics of insecurity. He could accept the assurances he is receiving from Eisenhower on a regular basis that there was no possibility of a Soviet advantage, and indeed the United States had a massive nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union. This would give, was what Eisenhower was telling Kennedy privately. The administration was sending documentation, secret documentation to the Kennedy campaign. Listen, we're the ones ahead. Stop talking about the Soviet Union being ahead of us. It's a lie. It's not true. It's it's irresponsible. If Kennedy were to accept this in 1960, however, he would be losing a devastating political weapon. He had this great strategy of dealing with Nixon, his rival in 1960, by accusing Nixon of either being naive if he said that the Soviet Union wasn't ahead, or if he admitted that the Soviet Union was ahead, well, it was his administration that allowed that to happen. It was a fantastic political strategy undertaken by Kennedy. If Kennedy admitted that America was safe and it was well ahead of the Soviet Union in the arms race, he would lose support among these alarmists in the Democratic Party and in the universities who were advocating for more and more spending, more and more militarization. He would lose support if he acknowledged that the United States was ahead from the industrialists who were looking to build new weapon systems, for the labor unions who would be getting new jobs as a consequence of these new weapon systems. Kennedy knew, especially by the summer and fall of 1960, he was going to be in a very tight election against Richard Nixon. He knew that he was getting tremendous advantage from his polling as a result of the Democratic effort to portray the Democratic Party as being even more hawkish with respect to the Cold War than the Republicans. Was Kennedy going to abandon all of these advantages in a tight election? No way. So what Kennedy did in 1960 was accuse the Eisenhower administration of having neglected American defenses and hyping a very dangerous alarmist idea of a missile gap, even when he knew that these claims were untrue. And this, of course, was one of the factors that led Eisenhower, in his famous farewell address in early 1961, to warn American public about the military-industrial complex, which he saw in action in a very vivid way in the campaign of 1960. So we're not trying to pick on Kennedy. It's not like he was the only politician who did this, although this we think is a rather vivid example of it. But what we're trying to suggest is there's a political system in the United States which pushes political candidates, especially when they're in their situation like Kennedy was, of being unwilling to accept the notion that the United States has done all it can do to make itself safe. Security and safety, in a sense, become the adversaries of this way of thinking, and Kennedy was simply just a very stark example of that process in the campaign of 1960. And on that note, I go back to Fred.
The tag team approach continues, and you'll be maybe happy to know that we've come to our last segment. We are keen to discuss and to debate with you, and so I'll be brief as I finish up. But the last point that we really want to make is that what we've been describing, hopefully with some coherence here, and certainly more coherence in the book, as being a condition of Cold War America, in fact, continues afterwards. That if, in fact, it is true, as we argue, that politicians and operators in Washington saw it in their fundamental interest to deny that the United States was secure, no matter what was happening overseas, if it was in their interest to talk up threats, to perpetuate the politics of insecurity, I don't think there's very little reason to believe, it seems to us, that changed after the collapse and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. After 1989, we argue at the end of our book, the military-industrial complex remained a power within itself, largely insulated from public opinion, resistant to correction from the outside. Thousands of firms continued to be dependent on military contracts, as did communities and labor unions across the country. Interest groups favoring a hegemonic U.S. foreign policy retained outsized clout, while those arguing for reduced global presence remained, as during the Cold War, mostly on the fringes. And we talk a little bit in the book about the developments in the 1990s in this regard, and the rise of neoconservatives and the arguments of neoconservatives, the degree to which, as the decade progressed, they came to define the terms of the foreign policy debate, at least to a large extent in Washington. And the discourse took on a familiar refrain. Because just as no Democrat or Republican after 1945 wanted to be tagged with the dreaded soft on communism label, so no politician around the turn of the 21st century was going to take the chance of being called weak-kneed on Saddam Hussein. By 2006, Pentagon spending topped $500 billion, or roughly $60 million per hour. America spent more on its military than the rest of the world combined, and 10 times more than its closest competitor, China. The addiction, and that's a phrase that George Kennan, we haven't talked about George Kennan very much today, but he is a very important figure in our book. He's on the first page and he's on the last page, I believe. And Kennan refers in a variety of writings to an addiction. And what he's really talking about is this military-industrial complex, in essence. The addiction, it seems to us, continued and, in fact, continues. And probably little reason to think that this is changing under President Obama. This is something we can discuss in a few minutes. Many critics of America's two current wars, and many people who defend those two wars, suggest that the global war on terror represented a new form of foreign policy, one shaped decisively by the absence of great power rivals to the United States and the murky subnational nature of the terrorist enemy. But much of what went on between 2001 and 2010 actually partook of long-standing political traditions, we argue, that were formed over the past 60 years. And it seems to us that President Eisenhower's claim in his farewell address of 1961 that, quote, an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, unquote, must stand guard against the disastrous rise, again his phrase, of a military-industrial complex remains as true now as it was then. And what I will do here is just conclude with George Kennan, since I've just mentioned him. I'll conclude by quoting Kennan, who is the great diplomat historian who is sometimes called the father of containment. Kennan, of course, became disillusioned with the Cold War at an early point, and his ultimate assessment of that conflict is quite close to what we argue in our book. And he once said this, George Kennan did. He said that perhaps a strategy of containment should now be targeted not so much at a foreign adversary, but at an American political system that threatens to undermine a hard-fought Cold War victory from within. He said this right after the end of the Cold War. It could in fact be said, Kennan concluded, and I quote, that the first thing we Americans need to learn to contain is, in some ways, ourselves, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And as I said at the beginning, it's a pretty provocative thesis that they're suggesting in many ways. And my guess is that a number of you will have reactions to this. Please remember to head for the microphone, which Jamie has already done. So please, you can start.
Thank you. I'm James Galbraith. I'm a professor here at the school. I want to thank you for a very stylish presentation. You said at the outset that there was no attempt to pursue an endgame to the Cold War, and that's in fact the premise of your argument. And I want to raise some questions about that premise and let you comment on them. The questions, I think, need to be placed in context of what the Kennedy administration knew, what Kennedy knew in 1960 and what the administration knew in early 1961. It's important to understand that while Eisenhower suspected from the U-2 flights that the Soviet Union did not have the missiles it claimed to have, the field of vision of a U-2 is fairly narrow. Cloud cover was very extensive. And the U.S. did not have definitive intelligence on this point until July, August of 1960, when the first satellite, Corona, went up and the film was analyzed. At that point, it became clear that the Soviet missile fields did not exist. The missile gap at that had already become a public debate on the basis of Air Force estimates from before that period. When Kennedy took office in January of 1961, he was briefed on this, and he assigned Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick to make a public speech, which acknowledged the point that you claim was not acknowledged, namely that the United States was far ahead of the Soviet Union in nuclear capability. That was clear to Kennedy, and it was a public statement of the Kennedy administration from fairly early on. The administration then went on in numerous ways to lay the groundwork for an endgame to the Cold War. Averell Harriman in 1961 went to Geneva and neutralized Laos. In 1961 as well, Kennedy allowed the wall in Berlin to basically diffuse the Berlin crisis without the opening of hostilities that were threatened at that time. In 1962, over Cuba, as is very well known, he agreed to what was essentially a quid pro quo, the removal of the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and essentially a no-invasion pledge of Cuba. In 1963, he negotiated a atmospheric test ban treaty and gave the famous speech at American University. And at the end of 1963, although Fred, you and I have had a disagreement on this, he did make a decision to withdraw all U.S. combat forces from Vietnam by the end of 1965. One of the things you may not know, as part of my family history, is that at one of their last meetings, which I believe would have been in October of 1963, President Kennedy asked my father, who had served as United States ambassador to India, whether he would be willing to go to Moscow in 1964 as U.S. ambassador. And the purpose of that would have been to act as Kennedy's representative in negotiating an endgame to the Cold War. So I think there is a lot of evidence that, in fact, this was the intent, at least, of the Kennedy administration in this window between 1961 and 1963. Thank you.
Why don't I take that first part and you take the second part?
Okay, so now they have to caucus on the
Yeah,
tax, right?
It's like conferring with my lawyer at a Senate confirmation hearing.
Yeah. Well, so
Should I
Campbell,
answer?
you're the nuclear guy, and Fred, you're the Vietnam guy.
Yeah, that's what I was basically saying there.
But have at it.
The missile gap argument, I mean, as we say in the book, obviously definitive proof couldn't have been known even after the satellites. I mean, you can't know for sure if you've missed something.
The coverage of Corona was pretty good.
I'm not arguing with that. But the point is that even if the coverage had been perfect, even if Eisenhower had a signed statement from Khrushchev admitting that there's no missiles, Kennedy wasn't going to accept it. He had no interest in getting rid of this claim, and he was being given very strong evidence from the Eisenhower administration that was the contrary. Obviously, nothing is 100%, but what we're saying is that Kennedy had no reason to err on the side of going with.
It's a matter of record, though, that the Kennedy administration, did accept it very early on.
They accepted it after they won the election.
Well, yes.
Yeah,
that's when the administration takes office.
Yeah, but okay, they won the election. McNamara makes the slip in March. Of course, there's never a missile gap, which indicates that they knew it well before the election. And then Gilpatrick says it publicly in October. Yeah, I mean that would tell me that they had a pretty good idea that they were making it up at the time, and that they had a strong interest in disbelieving or choosing not to accept the Eisenhower assurances. Again, as we say, I think we have a nice line in the book that unless Kennedy goes to Russia and counts them himself, there's no way to know for sure. The political pressures are pushing him in the direction of believing in the missile gap.
And I would just say, Jamie, on the broader point that you're making, that in a way the talk today doesn't fully capture our depiction of Kennedy. So in fact, in the book, it's a rather more sympathetic portrayal of Kennedy than may have come across today. We certainly argue that that in many ways John F. Kennedy is a Cold War skeptic, and I think he grows while in office, as our book shows. I think he has real desires to diffuse Cold War tensions, especially after the missile crisis. We applaud, by and large, his handling, by the way, of the missile crisis. I think, and here you and I are in full agreement, I think he is from a very early point a skeptic on Vietnam. But in fact, even on Vietnam, this is part of our argument. The pressures are very great on John F. Kennedy, I believe, to disavow any intention of seeking a negotiated settlement. He certainly, I think, wants to do so, and here we're getting into counterfactuals, and I'll be very brief. He certainly, I think, wants to do so until after he's reelected in 1964. This, again, goes along with the argument that we're making. But I think you would find, in fact, that many of the things you said at the mic are fully in accord with what we say in the book about what Kennedy seeks to do. He's not able to do it. If he lives past Dallas, lots of possibilities, and we in fact explore those a little bit in a page or two in the book. A compatriot of mine, Anders Stefansson, or Stefansson, as we'd say in Swedish, has argued, as you may know, Jamie, that in fact the Cold War ends in 1963 for some of the reasons that you articulate. We don't buy it, but there is something to that argument.
Hi, my name is Nancy Buell, and it's a pleasure to listen to you today. I have a question for you, again, following up on his comments about the SALT agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which I think was negotiated under Kennedy's administration and caused a great uproar because people felt that we were yielding to the Russian thing. And I may have my dates mixed up, so could you answer that, please?
Yes, well, I just have to say that what you say is correct. I mean, it was initially concluded under Johnson and then Nixon. But the first SALT treaty was seen by many conservative critics as a giveaway to the Soviets, even though you could argue that it in many ways nailed down a permanent American advantage in certain kinds of systems. The SALT was one of those things that you wonder why it didn't happen earlier in the Cold War. But
did it happen when the agreement was agreed to under Kennedy's administration?
No, it's later.
No, it's later. You have an ABM treaty concluded under Kennedy, but
And the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi there. My name's Armin. I'm a freshman, undergraduate freshman with the LH Honors Program. My question spawns off of the first professor's. Definitely opened up a can of worms with that question. Generally goes to, in terms of, especially namely Reagan, at the Reykjavik conference in Iceland, he and Gorbachev, he had the option there to end SDI. And therefore, would take a big leap forward towards ending the Cold War. Why do you think he decided against that? It could be either that either side feared they would renege on the promise of, not proliferating the arms. Either they could be seen as softies on the communist issue, as you brought up. Why do you think, personally, Reagan did not end SDI right then and there to take a great leap forward in the endgame?
Well, first of all, delighted to see you as a freshman up at the mic. Good for you coming up and posing a question. My sense is, and I think this is certainly what we suggest in the book, is Reagan believed in it. For a very long time, I think he saw this as a system that would work, that would therefore protect the United States. And I think he came to believe, because he had an abhorrence of the thought of nuclear war that I think was deep and heartfelt, that in fact it would ultimately therefore also serve humankind and in fact ensure superpower peace in that regard. Yeah. I think that's the main explanation for his thinking.
Yeah, we deal with this at some length actually, because it's a pretty important episode in the end of the Cold War, and he also made the argument to Gorbachev that there was no reason for Gorbachev to worry about SDI, because this was in the context of them talking about eliminating all strategic nuclear weapons, right? They're talking, they're going back into this back room, and all their aides are starting to panic. What the hell are they doing? They're talking about abolishing all strategic nuclear weapon systems, and there's even talk about abolishing all nuclear weapons. But leave it to the strategic, the big intercontinental missiles. And Reagan said to Gorbachev, hey, if we do that, then this SDI is not going to threaten you at all, right? You're not going to have any missiles that it would shoot down. It would be only for rogue states. So that was one of the sort of the more strategic arguments he put to Gorbachev. But fundamentally, he believed in it, and he also thought that the United States was so predominant over the Soviet Union by the middle of the 1980s that it had no reason to cede at any serious negotiations.
In terms of mindset, we're more stable, you're saying?
Yeah, the U.S. is coming into Reykjavik feeling much more powerful than a Soviet Union that's clearly in decline. Why should he give up this pet project? You go into a negotiation with someone you're more powerful than. Why do you give up something you care about?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your time.
My name is Saul Elbine, and my question would be, you talk about how there's all of this, there are all of these domestic actors in Washington like Truman and Kennedy and all these vested interests who have a real interest in pursuing these politics of insecurity and sort of playing up the threat from the Soviet Union. And I guess what I'm curious about is how much of this is conscious, how much of it is cynical manipulation, how much of it is just there's the choice to believe what you choose because the facts are so murky and they just choose the option that benefits them.
Good question.
I think it's an excellent question, and Campbell might want to come in too. I think there is a cynical element to the argument that we're making in this book. It's a cynical explanation to a degree. But one of the things we also say in the book, I think we say this, it's possible that the following ended up on the cutting room floor. But why take the chance was a question that we had, at least in an early draft. That's a question that policymakers, if they're not sure about something, I think often pose to themselves and decided, and especially in the early Cold War and in the late 1940s in particular, before containment has been achieved, as we put it, that's a question they often posed to themselves and to one another. And so it's not all a kind of cynical play for either electoral victory or careerist ambition, though that's certainly part of it.
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to the whole issue, the Kennedy missile gap thing, right? I'm not personally convinced that Kennedy knew 100% that there was no missile gap, but he's pushed in a political direction towards making that argument because the payoff is so great for making it, and because he doesn't know 100% either way. Why not err on the side of something that's going to maybe get you elected president rather than something that almost certainly will doom your campaign? So there's all sorts of examples like this throughout the book where there's almost sort of structural pressure on people to move in a direction. They may not be totally aware of it, right? So they're not always these cynics with top hats saying let's
In smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not the kind of argument we're making. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Hi there. Alan Cooperman, I'm a professor here. And I'll premise my questions by stating that I think it's sort of obvious that domestic politics plays a role in foreign policy. Having worked in Washington for 8 years, including on Capitol Hill, it seems to me sort of obvious. The question is, how big a role, and does it play the decisive role in explaining things such as the Cold War? So let's if I could summarize your argument, it would be that domestic politics is the reason that America fought the Cold War for so long. And so my question is, if that's true, should some other things be true, and do you think they're true? So I'll ask about two of them. Number one, is this true only of Cold Wars, or is this also true of hot wars? So there's a famous argument by Charles Beard, and I guess his wife, Mary, was it Mary? I think it was Mary, wrote that all of these past hot wars had been driven by domestic politics. So is that true, or is it not true? And if it's not true, how come domestic politics only drives Cold Wars but not hot wars? And then my second question, in this sort of comparative vein, is does this dynamic only work in the United States? Shouldn't it work in other countries? Shouldn't you be able to play the weak on defense card. In other countries, especially, think about Western Europe. I mean, Western Europe is a place that really is facing right on the bear. They don't have nuclear weapons, a lot of those countries, to defend themselves. Shouldn't it have been more intense there? Why weren't they spending huge amounts of their GDP on defense? Why weren't they moving to the right because of this domestic political? So what is so special about the United States that your causal mechanism only works here? Thank you.
Maybe I'll answer the first question, and then Campbell can try the second. And I would just preface my answer, Alan, if I may, by saying that I think I gave a talk at USC some years ago when this general subject came up, and I think your opening remark was a little different then. I think, if I remember correctly, maybe for the sake of argument, for the sake of argument, I think you said, and you were being provocative, but as I recall, you said domestic politics does not shape foreign policy. So that's my opening remark. No, but your first question is a good one, and I think that it can and does shape hot wars in addition to cold wars, and the example that I know best is Vietnam. And I would argue that that for all of the 5 presidents who dealt with Vietnam in a serious way, from Truman to Ford, I think that's 5, that Vietnam mattered in large part to the extent that it could do damage to their domestic political position. And I think it's certainly true of Lyndon Johnson, that it's primarily, it seems to me, about his domestic political position and about his historical legacy. I think he had severe doubts, and the tapes seem to me show this. I think he had real doubts that the outcome in Vietnam really mattered to American national security. Maybe there was a little bit of what we were describing earlier. Why take the chance? If there is a chance that the dominoes will fall and that, in fact, the fall of South Vietnam will have a disastrous geopolitical consequence, we should do what we can. But I don't think myself that that's what's driving his motivation. We deal, as I say, a lot with World War II. I think that's a counter-argument. And if the Beards were making this argument in part about World War II, and I think that they were, I wouldn't want to make it with respect to World War II. But do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, 2 things. One is, if you're asking about sort of previous war to before World War II, which I think you were, the difference between that and the Cold War is that no one tried to argue before World War II that the United States was facing some sort of basic existential threat. That was not something that people could say seriously in Washington. Mm-hmm. And so you had a different kind of politics, which was much more gratuitous. Look at the Spanish-American War. You have this war to save the Cubans, then you head off to the Philippines to get the China market, then you leave after a couple of years. I mean, it doesn't matter to most Americans.
My question was about the military-industrial complex, which veered
caused
the causal mechanism. This is all for industry. That's why we fight wars.
Yeah, or for economic. Yeah. Sorry, so you're asking.
No, so my question is, do
you
agree with that?
I personally don't agree with it, and that's not the argument we make, because it's not. He changes his argument actually during World War II and becomes more nuanced. But he at least initially argues that it's a Marxian argument about, or Hobbesian argument about American politics, which changes in the 1940s. That's the argument we make. We argue that after the Cold War, it's much more of a political situation, and it's driven by this notion of existential threat that emerged during World War II. So, not really a Beardian argument, although we are nice to him in the first chapter. As far as comparing to Europe, I mean, I think that I dealt that with the talk. We talk at length in the book about this issue of free security, that the American diplomatic experience is radically different from the European experience because of the fact that it's been safe for so long, that the discourse of foreign policy is naturally, almost organically politicized in a way it had not been in the European continent. And so that, ironically, you have a much greater threat inflation and a politicization of foreign policy in a country that's safe than it is in countries like in Western Europe that are used to being threatened. We begin our book with this great epigraph from Kenneth Waltz, He said absence of threat permits policy to become capricious. And if you want to sort of understand our book in a sentence, that would probably cover it.
And I would just say, in addition, that I think that European states, living cheek by jowl, living very close to one another, and having the experience, the brutal experience of numerous conflicts and wars, I think had come to appreciate, and you see this to some extent in the Cold War, what diplomacy can bring and the necessity for diplomacy. That I just don't know that Americans, in part because of this free security, had experienced.
So I'm going to be bad. We have still people waiting, and we're going to let them go in just a second. But I want to interject because I think this free security thing is pretty important, but I think it's exactly backwards, right? The people with free security in the Cold War, that was the Europeans because we were paying for it, and so they should be nuts, rabid, rabble-rousers, completely political. And the United States, for the first time in our history, when there were nuclear missiles pointed at us, didn't have free security. And so we should be the ones who think seriously in a reasoned way about security. And in fact, I think we actually did in particularly the early days of this in the 1950s. We had a pretty reasoned argument. And then as we continued, we actually knew there was a threat facing us, but we knew we had it licked, right? This was Eisenhower's wonderful realization that I don't need to go nuts because I've got it covered. And then over time, as the Soviets achieved parity, we started to have new security problems. Like there's a real challenge in the 60s and the 70s that the reason Eisenhower knew that that we had a real threat, but he had it licked, that we had nuclear superiority. Mutual assured destruction was bad for the United States, right? Because what we had before mutual assured destruction was nuclear first strike, right? We had primacy.
I'm not sure I agree with bad.
And we lost our primacy when the Soviets got a secure second strike. And then we have a real security problem, and so we reason carefully, right? So the point is that the United States has a series of real security challenges for the first time in our history. First one is to understand what to do about the Soviets being able to launch nuclear missiles at the United States. The second thing is, what do you do when the Soviets have a secure second strike so that we have to adopt our doctrine to it? And this is what Scoop Jackson is about. And this is what the whole counterforce debate of the 70s is about. And so there's a series of security problems. So we think hard, and I just wanted to get this riff in because it really responds on the European side, that they had free security for the first time ever and should be going nuts by your prediction. So I don't know how you resolve. I'd like you both to comment about the U.S. and the Europeans.
But when you say go nuts, you mean that they should be rabidly
politicized. They should be highly political. Your prediction is that when you have free security, you should be highly political about your interpretation of security threats.
But I'm not sure I fully accept the premise. Churchill, to use one example, and then Eden, they were constantly fearful that if you had a Soviet-American confrontation, where the bombs were going to rain down was on East Anglia. It was going to be over British territory. I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, but the level of security they felt may not have been as great as you're suggesting. I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I would also go on to say that what we're arguing is that free security created a tradition over time. I mean, the Europeans have, in a sense, this kind of free security, although I would totally agree with Fred's demurral there. But that was a very new thing for them. I mean, political traditions need time to develop. I mean, the Europeans can't suddenly say in 1950, "Ha, we're totally safe." I mean, that would be a weird attitude for any European to take after the previous 40 years. So, I would say that we're talking about historical evolution, and free security for the United States was this long political tradition. For the Europeans, it wasn't. Should I take this on mutual assured destruction? I mean, as you know, I've written a lot on Eisenhower and all that. I mean, we're not very sympathetic in the book, I have to say, to Scoop Jacksons of the world, or to the people who worried about developing response to Soviet secondary capability in the 60s and 70s. We're sort of mad purists in this book, and probably don't want to get into too technical of a debate about that.
Willing to write off Europe. Right.
No.
That would be the technical debate we won't have. But okay, so you're mad purists, meaning the implication for our exchange that
Eisenhower solved the problem in the 50s. You had various attempts, largely for political reasons, to get it to think that the problem wasn't solved, but that following the arguments, people like Bob Jervis, those attempts were spurious, and mutual destruction obtained after like the 1950s. We're moving away from history and towards IR and stuff here, but yeah.
Correct. Well, let's have the rest of the.
Alan Shearer, UT faculty, but for the School of Architecture. And this actually picks up from your comment about the absence of threat issue. And so I'm wondering if, so we've got the Cold War, threat of Soviet Union, which may not be as big a threat as possible, but the rhetoric is maintained for domestic politics. I'm with you on that part. But I'm just wondering, is in the course of your work, did you come across the notion of simply shifting the referent to some other kind of security, in the way that now we have a proliferation of securities, from energy security to environmental security? You can securitize anything you want, almost, with the fundamental notion that it will still provide an existential demise. And in this case, I'm simply also wondering, is it becomes a kind of follow-up to, I think it was Dulles who testified before the Senate in 1945, that all national security has a function of everything that we do in civilian life also. And so I'm wondering, is in the course of your research, does that actually get picked up? And if not, why was the possibility of simply shifting the referent to some other security mechanism, presumably that would also enable the president to do things too, not picked up?
I don't know.
I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I guess the one example of securitization of American foreign policy politics during the Cold War that wasn't, the old-fashioned dealing with the Soviet Union in terms of geopolitics would be the anti-communist crusade at home, which became, by the early 1950s, in a sense, for a while at least, extreme to the point that domestic communism was portrayed as a threat as dire as external communism. Although we talk about that and don't describe it in the terms that you use, but I would say that'd be sort of one obvious example. The notion of contriving other threats to the United States apart from the old-fashioned, nation-state threat or this domestic ideology, I don't see a lot of that in Washington, really, before the end of the Cold War. Of course, you see a lot of it today.
After that, right,
yes,
absolutely.
But I don't see a lot of that in Washington before the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, no, and I was going to suggest that and I don't think it was quite what you had in mind, but that the Red Scare, the domestic campaign, is maybe the only one I could think of.
Hi, I also have a question about Reagan, and it's more general, especially the period of, I think it was late 83 or early 84 when he gives the Evil Empire speech, and he's really ramping up the Cold War, yet he can't sell the Contra War to the American people. He can't sell it to Congress. So the domestic pressures are really going in the opposite direction. So do you attribute that to Reagan himself, his personality, his proclivities, or is there really a fundamental difference in the relationship between domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy in the post-Vietnam War era?
I mean, 83 is an interesting year for Reagan because he gives the Evil Empire another rhetoric earlier in that year. And then he, of course, famously has two experiences in the fall. The first is his visit to PSYOP, where he's exposed to the plans that will go ahead if the United States gets into a total war with the Soviet Union. And then soon after that is this Able Archer incident, where NATO plans this major war game in Western Europe that was simulating a sort of major war against the Warsaw Pact. And Reagan later learns that the Soviet Union actually came to believe that this might have been the beginnings of an actual war. And this, we argue, led Reagan in 1984, among other things, to back off a bit from this sort of hardcore anti-Soviet position he'd taken earlier on in his administration. Contra's issue was not really a factor until his second term in his considerations of U.S.-Soviet relations. And we talk about the Iran-Contra affair at some length. And in fact, this is actually one of the bigger stories in the Reagan administration in the second term, even while the Cold War is coming to an end. But in his first term, the '83 is an interesting year. Reagan seems to shift because of these. Right?
Can you talk more broadly about the relationship between domestic politics and U.S. policy post-Vietnam?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a big topic, but I mean, the argument we make in the book would be that you have, after Vietnam, a bit of retrenchment, a move to the left and in American politics, because in response to this.
But what I would just add is that we found some really interesting stuff on the Carter period that surprised me, at least. I don't know, I can't speak for Campbell, but we found to a greater degree than I thought we would, frankly, arguments by Jimmy Carter's advisors, not only in 1979 and 80, but even before this, before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and before developments in Iran, arguments by Brzezinski and others that, in fact, you need, in order to strengthen your domestic political position, you need to take a tougher stand on Moscow and on the Cold War. And very much, excuse me, the same kind of rhetoric that one sees pre-Vietnam begins to come out again. It really then takes off, I think, in 79 and 80, and especially as his campaign looks to be in some trouble in 1980. And I think Brzezinski again stands out as an example of somebody who's pushing that argument. We haven't talked very much today about. We haven't talked at all about relations with other Soviet-supported states, and here I have in mind Cuba. And Carter privately was very interested in lifting the embargo, or at least had real doubts about its efficacy. But he told Cyrus Vance, there are very few votes to be gained by changing our Cuban policy now. And that's an example of, it seems to me, of continuity, notwithstanding what Campbell said about Vietnam changing the equation. There's also continuity here that I think is important.
We have pretty much come to the end of our time, but I just want to ask a clarifying question for that. When you talk about a turn to the left in American policy and politics in the 70s or any time, what do you mean by that, except a turn to the things that you prefer?
Since you uttered the phrase, I'll let you answer the question.
Fred and I actually had a long debate in an introduction about whether we should use the terms right or left at all. And I probably shouldn't have said left because I was the one arguing that we shouldn't use right or left. But what I would say after Vietnam, and I don't think this is really a particularly controversial point, is that the condition we're describing in the Cold War, where you have this kind of structural drift towards alarmism and militarism, what was lessened a bit after Vietnam because of the traumatic experience of that war. That's pretty much all I would say about that point.
And I would say, maybe this will be the last point, maybe it won't, but I would still say I'm struck by how little it changed. One of the things we say, I think, in our introduction is, if you're a Martian and you land on the Earth pretty much at any time between the late 1940s and 1989, and you listen to political rhetoric and you listen to political debate, especially at come election time, you could be forgiven for believing that the United States is in a life and death struggle with an evil foe that is out to vanquish us. And in fact, if it's not losing that battle, it certainly is a very real possibility. I think there is a tacking to the left, certainly for a period after Vietnam. But it's not that much.
Not that substantial. Yeah.
No.
I'm really pleased to know that you guys are confident that we weren't in a life and death struggle all those years. That seems like an important case to make. I'd like to thank you guys for coming. I think we had a very interesting and entertaining discussion. We got a great audience reaction, and I think that's a testimony to your provocative thesis and a good book. And I hope that all of you will rush out. Oh, you don't have to go out. Rush to the table in the back and pick up your copy.
We have our signing pens here.
Yes. Thank you all for coming.